Right now, you probably know someone you can no longer talk to about politics. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's an old friend. Maybe you've just stopped bringing it up entirely because you already know how it ends. That feeling, that slow, grinding sense that the country is splitting down the middle and no one knows how to stop it, feels new to you because you're living inside it. But this isn't new. It's not even close. There was another moment in American history when the numbers looked almost exactly like this, when pollsters couldn't find a path where both sides trusted the same institutions, where dinner tables cracked along fault lines that no one had drawn intentionally, when the question wasn't, are we divided? It was, are we going to make it through this? That moment has a name. It has a cause. It has a turning point, and it has an outcome that most people have completely forgotten. To understand what's happening right now in your town, in your family, and in your country, you have to go back to a specific decision that Americans made in a very specific year. Not a war, not an assassination, a choice. A quiet, structural choice about how power would work and who would hold it. Because what you're living through isn't random. It's a pattern, and patterns can be traced. To understand how deep the current divide goes, you first need a number. Political scientist Liliana Mason, in her 2018 book, Uncivil Agreement, found something that surprised her. It wasn't that Americans disagreed more on policy than they used to. On many core issues, healthcare access, infrastructure investment, the basics of economic fairness, the gap between average Democrats and average Republicans was smaller than the headlines suggested. What had changed was something more primal. What had changed was how much people hated each other. Mason measured what researchers call effective polarization, not policy distance, but emotional hostility, and found it had nearly doubled in the span of 2 decades. You weren't just disagreeing with your neighbors anymore. You had started to see them as a threat. That's a different kind of divide. It's harder to fix with a good policy argument. It's harder to cross with a handshake. It doesn't live in the mind the way a disagreement about tax rates does. It lives in the gut. And once a divide moves from the mind to the gut, it starts behaving like something older than politics, something ancient, something your brain was not built to reason its way out of easily. So where did this come from? The clearest parallel to what you're watching right now isn't the 1960s, though people consistently reach for that comparison. The civil rights era was defined by a specific moral rupture, a fight over who counted as fully human under the law. That divide was catastrophic and real, and it left scars that have not fully healed. But the texture of that conflict was different. The sides were drawn more clearly around a single, visible fault line. The era that most closely mirrors this moment is the period running from the mid-1960s through the mid-1990s, a stretch historians sometimes call the Great Sorting. And to understand it, you have to understand what happened to the two major political parties during those decades. Before 1964, the Democratic Party contained both Southern conservatives and Northern liberals. The Republican Party contained both Northeast moderates and Midwest traditionalists. The parties overlapped. They had to negotiate with each other's factions just to pass a bill. A Southern Democrat and a New England Republican might disagree on economics but find common ground on agriculture, on infrastructure, on foreign policy, because their party identity did not perfectly predict every single one of their beliefs. Then, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and in a private moment he turned to an aide and said something that multiple historians have since confirmed, that he had likely delivered the South to the Republican Party for a generation. He was off by about a generation and a half. Over the next 30 years, the South moved systematically into the Republican column. Northern moderates drifted out of the GOP. The ideological overlap between the two parties, the shared middle ground where compromise was not just possible but structurally required, shrank steadily, and then, somewhere around 1994, it essentially disappeared. That year, Newt Gingrich led Republicans to a sweeping congressional victory using a strategy that explicitly cast the political opponents not as a fellow American with a different set of ideas, but as the enemy of American civilization itself. His now infamous memo to Republican candidates instructed them to use words like sick, pathetic, traitors, and corrupt when describing Democrats. Not Democratic policies, not Democratic votes, Democrats, the people, the humans sitting across the aisle. It worked, and what works spreads. Political scientist Lee Drutman, in his analysis of decades of American legislative behavior, documented what happened next with uncomfortable precision. The number of bills passed with bipartisan support began to collapse, not slowly, but sharply. Within a decade, the architecture of the American Congress, which had been built on the structural assumption that the parties would overlap enough to have to negotiate, began to seize up entirely. What had been a system designed for compromise was now being operated by two teams that had collectively decided that compromise was betrayal. Here is where it gets harder to look at. By the mid-2000s, something had shifted below the surface. It wasn't just politicians who had sorted themselves. It was ordinary Americans. It was your neighborhood. Robert Putnam, the Harvard political scientist who spent decades studying the decline of social trust in America, documented in his research a quiet, compounding process. Americans had begun physically sorting themselves into communities that matched their politics. Not because anyone ordered them to, because the things that predict your politics, your education level, your proximity to urban density, your religious practice, your relationship to manufacturing versus services, also predicted where you were likely to live, what schools your children would attend, what churches you'd walk to, and what people you'd actually know. By 2008, the average American was less likely than at any point in the previous 50 years to have a close friend who voted differently than they did. Think carefully about what that means. If you have never had a real, sustained relationship with someone who sees the world differently than you do, you have never had to update your picture of who they actually are. You have only ever had the picture that your media, your social feed, and your immediate social circle painted for you. And that picture got darker with every year the sorting continued. Every year there was one fewer person at your table to complicate it. Then came 2016. Then came a global pandemic that turned every policy question into an identity marker, a loyalty test, a signal of which team you were on. Then came an election result that tens of millions of Americans refused to accept, and then a day in January that a country watched together and processed entirely alone in completely separate realities. Right now, in the run-up to the 2026 midterms, you are watching an electorate that has been sorting itself for 60 years reach something close to a structural breaking point. Pew Research Center's longitudinal polling shows that the share of Americans who hold a very unfavorable view of the opposing party has grown from roughly 16% in 1994 to over 60% today. Not, I disagree with their policies. Not, I think they're misguided. I am genuinely afraid of what happens to this country if they win. That is not a policy disagreement. It is a threat perception. And human beings who feel genuinely threatened do not reason their way toward compromise. They circle the wagons, they consolidate, they treat any contact with the opposing tribe as a potential vulnerability. The candidates running in 2026 understand this perfectly. The most effective campaign ads this cycle do not argue for policy position. They generate fear of the other side. Not because every political consultant is uniquely cynical, but because it works. Because a brain operating in threat mode will click, share, donate, and turn out to vote at a measurably higher rate than a brain that feels safe. You are not watching a rational behavior unfold around you. You are watching very rational actors exploit a very predictable feature of human neurology. And the more clearly you see that, the harder it becomes to be moved by it without actively choosing to be. Here is what the history books record about the last time the sorting reached this level. It was the 1850s, a country so fractured that an entire political party, the Whigs, who had produced 2 presidents, simply ceased to exist within the span of a decade because it could no longer hold its internal contradictions together. A Congress so paralyzed by tribal hostility that a senator was beaten unconscious on the floor of the chamber with a metal-tipped cane, and the man who did it was celebrated as a hero by half the country. A population consuming newspapers specifically designed to portray the other region as morally depraved and culturally subhuman. That one ended in a war. That is the honest answer, and it deserves to be said plainly. But there is a second precedent that receives far less attention. The period from roughly 1910 to 1930 produced a level of political violence, economic catastrophe, and institutional distrust that rivaled anything the modern era has generated. Labor organizers were assassinated. Racial pogroms swept through major American cities from Tulsa to East St. Louis. The Ku Klux Klan reformed and reached an estimated peak membership of nearly 4 million Americans in the early 1920s. Not in the South alone, but in Indiana, in Colorado, in Oregon. Congress was consumed by corruption scandals that touched both parties and gutted public faith in representative government. And then, slowly and painfully, something shifted. Not because Americans became more virtuous, not because a single great leader delivered the perfect speech, but because a set of shared, concrete, undeniable problems, the Great Depression, and then the slow rise of fascism across the ocean, forced enough Americans into enough shared experience that the tribal identity softened at the edges. Not disappeared, not resolved, not forgotten, but slightly softer. Soft enough for institutions to function again. Soft enough for coalitions to form between people who genuinely disliked each other but recognized they were staring at the same problem. This mechanism is not inspiring. It is humbling. It suggests that what pulls a divided people back towards each other is not a moral argument or an eloquent appeal to shared values. It is shared stakes. It is the moment at which the cost of maintaining the divide becomes visibly, undeniably higher than the cost of tolerating the existence of the other side. That moment always arrives. It has arrived before, in this country, more than once. The only question that history leaves genuinely open, is whether you reach it before the catastrophe forces it on you, or after. Right now, you probably know someone you can no longer talk to about politics. That is not proof that the country is broken beyond repair. It is proof that you are living in the predictable, documented, historically traceable peak of a sorting process that began 60 years ago and was accelerated by every technology that made it cheaper and easier to exist entirely inside a world that confirmed what you already believed. The historians knew this moment was coming. The data pointed here for decades. And the same data, the same long record of how human beings have fractured and strained and eventually found their way back to something functional, points to what comes next. You've been sorted. Most people have. But sorted is not the same as sealed. And what history shows, over and over again, is that the people who changed the direction of a divided country were almost never the ones waiting for someone else to go first.